Today I'm going to go through the process of how I make panel doors. I'm going to be making shaker doors, but it's the same process whether you're making shaker doors, raised panel doors, any type of doors really. I'll be using rail and style bits, and I'll also be using rough lumber from the sawmill. In this case I'm using poplar, $1.50 a board foot. You can use pine, oak, maple, obviously anything you want. The first thing I do though is when I get the boards, I sort them out, because you're going to find that the boards you're going to get will be warped, they're going to be bowed, they're going to have knots in them. Unless you pay a premium price at a lumber yard, you're going to be getting whatever it is you get, and you have to sort out the wood so that you have all clear wood. So to start with, I have 1x8, 1x10, 1x6 boards, different random lengths, random widths. So what I do first of all is plane them down. And I do that to a little wider than 3/4 of an inch to start. But eventually I'm going to want to end up at 3/4 of an inch. All right. Now, when you get the wood, as I said, it's going to be bowed and it's going to be warped. But what I do is I start with my boards, and I rip them down. In this case, I rip them down to 2.5 inches wide. That's wider than I want. When I end up, I'm going to want them 2.25 inches. But as you can see from this board here, it's bowed like a banana. All right. You try to, but when you push it together, it just comes apart at the other end. So you know what I mean? So to get around that, I initially cut the boards random lengths, and I go through it and I cut out where the knots are. In this case, you can see there's a knot here, so I'm going to end up cutting this board right out here. I'll cut the knot out. And I cut them all over length because I'm going to be putting them through the joiner, or excuse me, in this case I'm going to put them through the planer. And when you put them through the planer, you get what's known as snipe, which is a little part at the end of the wood. I don't know if you can see it or not, but it's where it leaves the joiner, the planer, and it messes the wood up a little. So you make them longer, and then you trim them down to the right length you want. Now, after you have them ripped into strips, and you rip them down into the approximate lengths you want, then what I do is I put them through the planer again, only this time I put them up on their edge. And I do this instead of using the joiner, because with the joiner, it's hit or miss if you're going to get it the same, if you're going to get in the same dimension. Because every time you run it through the joiner, it takes a little more off. So if you don't run each one through exactly 3 times, 4 times, or whatever, you're going to have different widths. But when you put it through the planer like this, they all come out exactly the same. When you're done with it, you take a batch of them, like this, put them all together, take a sander, and you get a nice sanded finish. All right? But again, these are longer than what you're going to want to end up with. In this case, these are 30 inches. Some of them are 31 inches. It doesn't really matter. Just make them longer than what you want, because you're going to be trimming everything down later. When setting up the bits, you're going to want to do the end of the rail. The rail is the part that goes horizontal on the frame. You're going to want to do the end of that first. So what I do is put it down next to the bit, and then make sure that the bit is right on top when it just hits the very top of the wood. See, right there. So that would be flush with the top of the wood. Now, When you're cutting it, the bottom is actually the edge of that's the part you're going to be seeing. The bottom is what you're going to be seeing. And mark that front, because that has a little bevel on it. All right. So the next thing you want to cut will be the stiles. And those have to be cut so that this little tenon goes into a groove. If you notice, I'm using 2 different router tables. If you happen to have 2 different router tables, this is the time to use it, because once you get these bits up, you don't want to change them unless it's absolutely necessary, because it's very tedious to set them up exactly. If you don't happen to have 2 router tables, then do all your cuts on the ends of the rail, and then do all the cuts on your stiles. Don't do one door, then take everything apart and try to do another door, and so on and so forth. And cut some extras, because if you make a mistake, as I said, this is a bear to set up. Once you get it set up exactly, you don't want to touch it. If you're not concerned with accuracy, then yeah, you can take the bits out and put them in, and take them out and put them in, but you're not going to get a nice smooth mating edge unless you really fool with it a little. So try to use 2 routers. If you don't have them, then try to make all your parts first, and then change your bit and make the other part, the rail, or excuse me, the stile last. Another suggestion, if you don't happen to have 2 router tables, but have 2 routers, if you have the same plate, then you're all set. It's the same as having 2 tables. Just take the plate out and put the other one in. And again, here's the 1 router bit setup, and here's the other one. So if you don't happen to have the 2 tables, just take 2 plates, and then you can interchange them and use your same table and dust collection system. And in this case, I've got a miter gauge which I will use for the ends of the rails. Anyhow, just another tip. Everything's been set up for the ends of the rail cut. I have my fence set right in line with the bearing on the bit. I'm going to be using a miter gauge to keep it 90-degree angle from the fence. I have a backer board. The wood goes straight against it, and I have my dust collection set up, and just push it right through. Alright, so I'll start. Alright, so I've made the cut, made the adjustments, I've got a perfect fit. One thing I would also suggest is that you have feather boards. Without the feather boards, when it gets over here, it's going to have a tendency to want to rise a little, lower itself a little, wiggle around a little. Always use feather boards. Keep them tight, and you should have a nice clean edge. Now you can use a feather board going in this direction also. I've got a couple, but I'm not going to bother putting them on right now. But when you're doing the actual saw work or router work, make sure that you have feather boards. At minimum, holding it down to the table, but really you should have them holding them against the table as well. And that way you're going to have a nice, clean, straight edge without any bumps or imperfections. So I'll cut the rest of the rails and stiles, and then once I get that done, I'll show you about the panels, because there is a problem when you're using the 1/4-inch MDF. All right, there's another issue to take into consideration if you're using the router bit with a 1/4-inch groove. If you're planning on using plywood, 1/4-inch plywood isn't 1/4-inch. Right? You can see how much play there is in that. On the other hand, 1/4-inch MDF is a 1/4-inch, and you're groove is a 1/4 inch. So a 1/4 inch doesn't want to go into a 1/4 inch. So what do? You have to make the edge smaller. And to do that, I use a rabbiting bit. You want to set it up so that the wood just fits into the groove. You can see that there's not really a whole lot taken off the edge here. However, if you look at this one, it's sloppy. All right, you can move that all around. That's too much. This one, this edge, is just right. It's nice and tight. It's tight, but it's not so tight that you can't get it out and get it in. All right. So again, what I do is I set the rabbiting bit. Now in this case, this is a 3/8 inch rabbiting bit, which means it will take into the bearing 3/8 of an inch, which happens to be the same as the tongue on your rails, are 3/8 of an inch. So 3/8 of an inch. So let me just quickly show you how easy this is to do. It only takes a second to do your panels. Remember, have your dust on, your dust collector. If you don't, you're going to fill your shop with dust in just a second. So cover your ears for a minute. Also note feather boards. It's very important to have the feather boards. I don't have mine adjusted at this point, but if you don't have the feather boards down tight to the table, you won't be able to make that little recess on the edge. You'll be able to make it, but it won't be consistent the whole length of the piece of wood. So anyhow, once you got that, slips right in. You have a nice tight fit. Now you can use thicker than 1/4 inch wood when you're doing these panels. You can use 3/8, and in that case you'd have to take more off the edge in order to get it to fit into the groove, obviously. But I like the 1/4 inch, and you only have to take a very, very small amount off, very small. All right. Now, if you happen to be doing raised panels, that's different. You can adjust the raised panel bit up or down in order to make the correct thickness at the edge of the wood. And this is a raised panel bit. So depending on how high or how low you make it, this edge over here will give you a thicker or a thinner edge for your raised panel. So it's not as critical when you're using a raised panel bit as if you're using the 1/4 inch grooving bit. If you're working with MDF, it's extremely dusty. It's probably the nastiest wood going to cut. So what I like to do is hook up my shop vac, and I also have a air cleaner. But if you don't have that, your shop is going to be filled with dust with the first cut. So try to get whatever means of vacuuming hooked up you can. Again, this is just something I've got hung up in the ceiling close to the blade, and it doesn't get it all, but it's a lot better than not having anything. The thing is, when you're doing that though, you have to make sure that your filter on your vacuum is clear, because this will clog the filter up in just a matter of a couple cuts. All right, when it's time for assembly, it's important, critically important, that everything is perfectly square. I just have this sitting in here as a demonstration. So what I do is I start with something that I know has a perfect 90-degree angle. In this case, I'm using the piece of MDF that I'm going to be using for the door centers. I lay it out and then I screw 2 pieces of wood to give me a perfect 90-degree corner. All right. I don't leave this, obviously, I don't leave this piece of MDF here. I take it away. But now I have a perfect 90-degree corner. You can use a framing square. The problem with framing square is that it's not as long. It's just not as long, and there is a possibility of an error. So if you have something with a factory edge on it that you know is perfectly straight, 90 degrees, that's the way I would go. There you go. Now you can get yourself a nice, tight fit when you're gluing. And I'll show you that in a minute. There's another advantage to using a glue-up setup like this. It makes it a lot easier to measure the size of your panels. So in this case, I take the rail, I lay it down, and I put a mark on it. When I take it to the table saw, I'm going to cut to the inside of the mark. That gives me a little room for wiggling it around. Now, depending on the type of wood you're going to be using, sometimes you have to have expansion. But if you're using plywood or MDF, you really don't have to have the expansion because the wood doesn't move around like it does with a solid board. But anyhow, of course you can measure it with a ruler, but this is just a lot quicker and it's a lot more accurate. There's no measuring twice and cutting once with that. Again, I just lay it, mark it, take it to the table saw, and I cut to the inside of the line, and that gives me the little wiggle room that I'm looking for. Now, if you're making doors that are the same length or the same width, it's not necessary to measure each one individually. All you have to do is just put a little mark right on the board, and that way you save yourself some time. All right, so when you're gluing it up, you're going to want to have some long clamps. That'll help you pull the sides together. And as soon as you put the glue on, the wood's going to start swelling. So it is difficult to get them together if they're cut right to start with. So a couple of clamps will help you along the way. The other thing, have a piece of wood and just tap it in so that everything is square at the top. This is glued up, but if you note at the bottom, it's not touching. So what you have to do is come down to the other end, block of wood, and just tap it. Also, that I'm doing this on the back of the door, and the reason is that I am hitting against this edge. If I was doing it on the front of the door, in other words, if I had the door flipped over and was gluing it together, I could damage the edge when I'm putting a piece of wood in. So anyhow, still don't have it tight on this side, so I have to tap it a little more. And then once I have it tapped, I'll clean the glue up, put the clamps back on, pull it all back together, and I'll be done with this one.